Millions of frontline workers keep our economy running and are provided with the latest technology to do their jobs. But digital adoption, especially by frontline workers, is really hard.
This is Frontline Innovators. We explore how to overcome challenges and achieve success when we empower our essential workers.
I'm Justin Lake.
And I'm Gene Signorini. Together, we speak with experts who are leading the way and driving digital transformation to the front line.
This podcast is sponsored by Skillful, on a mission to help frontline workers learn and use the technology needed to succeed in their jobs. I'm your host, Justin Lake, and super excited about today's episode. Today's guest is known for driving change leadership activities for successful digital and organizational transformation. She's currently the change management manager at Ecolab. Please welcome to the show, Susan Evans. Hello, Susan.
Hey, Justin. Thanks for having me. So excited to talk to you today.
Same here. And I want to get started, as we often do, and ask you what you think is the biggest challenge facing the deskless workforce today.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Ever since I worked in customer service, I was always passionate around making our sales teams' jobs easier. I was always looking for ways to automate or streamline their tasks so that they could spend more time with our customers and, really enjoying what they do. Our sales teams are always on the go. They're in the car, in front of the customer, at the plant, at job sites, and they don't have time to sit at a computer, until it's late at night. And we're trying to, give them back their evenings with their families. But I think the biggest challenge, for our frontline workers today is having the time to learn new tasks and processes that replace old ones while on the go.
All right. So I'd like you to explore that a little bit more. Can you, because I think you're absolutely spot on. I think it just speaks to the amount of change that we're expecting many of the men and women on the front lines to have to absorb. And I'm curious if you have an example or two of something that you've seen in your organization that, is kind of represents that added burden that they have.
Well, digital presents, an additional layer of that learning, right? There's so much more that they have to learn faster. We are advancing faster every day in our digital applications and how they need to integrate those into their processes. So it's a lot of new content that they need to learn, but they're also changing their behaviors, how they interact with a customer, and in how they, change their daily activities.
Yeah, I think that's such a really good point. Is when we're rolling out new technology, rarely is the underlying process staying the same, right? So it's easy for everybody on the project team to get really wrapped up about the deployment of that new technology and new applications and perhaps new laptops or tablets or smartphones or whatever the case may be. But in almost every example I can think of, there are also underlying process changes, exactly as you described, that have to take place at the same time. And it's difficult to deal with all of that change at the same time.
Yeah, and I'll add that obviously the pandemic changed things for our frontline workers. We've always been a deskless workforce, but the pandemic drove our frontline workers to these digital tools in a much more prominent way. They're not able to go to the customer sites for quite a little bit of time, and we needed to enable them and how to rethink how they work with their customers now that they were closed. But in a business-to-business environment like our company is, we need to remember that our customers are our frontline workers as well. They need to, our frontline workers, our sales teams need to help our customers adopt those digital tools and processes as well to help them meet their needs.
It's a really, really interesting point. In your environment, because of the nature of your business, your frontline workers are interacting with the frontline workers of your customer organizations. And so hadn't really thought about that at all. It's exacerbating, what's been difficult for everybody. You're kind of putting that together and probably making an exponential challenge out of that.
Yeah, helping these customers, helping our reps coach our customers to manage their operations through remote data collection or monitoring. And with that, but the pandemic enabled that we were able to do that without insisting, or requiring our customers to change their processes. It happened quite naturally. They were then asking for our help, which is great. We were ready with the tools, but I think our sales force wasn't quite up to speed with the learning part of it. So, the pandemic made it a compelling event, right, for everyone to adopt the technology, and our frontline workers needed to be more digitally savvy, so they can teach their customers to leverage these new systems.
Yeah. Everything you just said is very near and dear to my heart with the business that we have during the day. So I want to come back to a couple of those things that you just talked about. But before we go into that any further, I want the audience to get a chance to know you a little bit more and understand your background and how you ended up in the role that you're in today. So share with us a little bit of that journey and some of the important milestones along the way.
Yeah, I was always interested in automation. I've been at my company for 34 years, right? So I think my interest evolved with, the environment and the needs, the digital needs of our customers. And so I was always on IT project management teams, always helping to build training content and teaching those end users how to use the tools, in front of them, learning their experiences and how we need to adjust those tools, right, to meet the needs of the end users. And I always found that really fascinating. Fast forward several years on many projects through, Greenbelt training and such. I really I was, collecting business requirements and executing on the development, but I really felt the end users, once we rolled it out, didn't know how to adapt the tool, right? So I really wanted to focus on those change components and learning, right? How do they learn? How do they adopt new processes? How do they change their practices, in the field? I mean, it's more than the tool, right? It's about how we use the tool.
Yeah. So I don't think you ever said the word empathy, but it's just coming out in everything that you've said. You just talked about your journey from the perspective of how you could help those men and women along the way. What was it that drove you to have such a strong compulsion to want to help in that way?
Yeah, I developed a really good relationship with our sales teams. As I said, I worked in customer service and really got to know the people, right? And they're people, just like we are, who aren't frontline workers, and they really want to do a good job, and they want, to be able to change. And I just wanted to help them. Just became, very close to understanding our business processes, but also their experiences. So it just was, natural for me. So.
Yeah, it really sounds like it. Do you think that people underestimate maybe some of the men and women on the front lines in terms of their willingness and their ability to do some of the things that we need them to do?
I think they're willing, for sure. And so we just have to be, cognizant of the fact that, we need to give them permission, right, to invest the time in learning new ways of executing their activities. I think that we don't do that often enough, is, give them the opportunity to grow and develop in a way as fast as we're growing and developing technically. This means self-learning, right? Using training content and absorbing it and figuring out how to apply that new process, peer-to-peer interactions, on-the-job application. All those things take time, and new skills take time to learn. And so we just want to, put learning as one of those important things that they need to do.
Yeah. And do you think that they're receptive to that, or do you see pushback from the men and women in the field?
I think they're receptive to it, but I also think they're challenged with juggling too many
Yeah.
tasks.
Yeah.
So I think if they're struggling, it's because there's too many things that are important, and they are important. Our customers important, solving their problems are important. Everything is very urgent and important these days. So
Yeah.
I think that's where they're struggling. And it's not the willingness, it's just, figuring out, priorities. And if you invest time up front in learning, I think you're going to get that back in not necessarily time, but perhaps, how you can help others or help customers. So
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, Susan, I could not possibly agree with you more. I think what you just said is what I have experienced too, is that the men and women on the front lines are very willing to learn and adapt. But you made a fantastic point, which is that they are really driven in the organization by other metrics, right? In the case of sales, they've got their sales numbers, number of calls that they're going on, number of appointments that they're having, and things like that. And on the delivery and execution side, they've got the number of stops and number of deliveries and all of those other things that are really the key metrics that most of those roles are driven to. And the unfortunate part is that when we talk about squeezing learning into that mix, we're not letting up off the gas on those other, key metrics that we're tracking. And so I feel like what you're saying is something that somebody, maybe you, need to stand on the mountaintop and scream out to the leadership in those organizations to say, this is a small investment of time on the front end. And yes, it may mean they get, one fewer calls done with a customer or, one fewer stops a day in the truck. But the investment in the long run is better engagement with that employee and ultimately, better engagement with your customers. Do you think that leadership generally buys into that, or do you think that there's some hesitation on their part because they're so driven to the other metrics of running the business?
What I find is I think they see that it's important. It's just how they're going to integrate that into all of it. So I think part of my role is to make that training accessible, easy to get at, timely. And so building training and communication plans that step you through that process in a way that perhaps they don't even know, right? They're making the time. It's just part of the cadence that we're working on. So I also feel that we need to focus on our frontline managers and helping them to coach our reps on integrating the digital capabilities so that it just becomes a natural part of it. So making all of this training available and in a way that meets their needs. Yeah.
That's a great point. I think I had this conversation with somebody else recently. It may have been on the podcast, so any listeners may find me repeating myself now. But I remember I worked at AT&T years ago, and when I first became a manager at AT&T, the first thing I did was get dropped into 2 or 3 weeks of leadership training as a first-time manager in the organization. So as kind of on the knowledge worker side of things in that organization, it was expected that I was actually going to get pulled out of the field for some amount of time and go off and get indoctrinated into this new role. And I think that's one of the things I've been thinking back to that time a lot lately. And that I think many of the men and women that I see getting promoted into supervisor and manager roles may have been driving a truck yesterday, and now they've gotten bumped into this new role. But they don't always get that same journey of leadership development. And I think they're craving, they deserve better leadership training so that they can actually grow into their role and allow them to be better at what we're asking them to do. And so I love that you raised that point. I think there's such an opportunity. I know we're primarily talking about, digital transformation and change management and things like that, but I think and I think I've come to realize this from a lot of the people that we've had on the show here, that there's an opportunity for us to do a better job of the leadership, mentorship of the leadership, so that they can be better coaches for their folks.
Yeah, and I think highlighting too that, we all need to have this agile mindset of 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 developing incrementally, right? We're developing incrementally as well as our customers, and helping our managers and our customers see that, um, will help us grow together at the same time. We want to prepare, um, very well for, the rollout or implementation of our digital tools, by maximizing our time together, leveraging our champion networks, our implementation managers, in a way that, it's a peer-to-peer, thing as well. So we grow knowledge right through small groups and then grow that, into bigger groups as we go. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that's awesome. When we talk about the challenges, I asked you your
Hmm.
perspective on what you think the biggest challenge
Hmm.
facing those men and women on the front lines is. But I'm curious, if you were to put yourself in their shoes, and
Hmm.
maybe you've asked some of them, what do you think they would say their biggest challenges are? Do they see it the same way, or are they looking inside the organization as with a different set of challenges?
I mean, the thing I hear the most is, having time to learn something new. I mean, the
Yeah.
biggest thing I hear the most. I think some of the challenges around, seeing, beyond, you want to replace something that you've done before with something new that you're doing that takes less time, but perhaps, the learning curve, right? Helping them understand there's a learning curve. And while like for like today, as I'm learning it may take the same amount of time. I'm going to get faster over time, and it's going to incrementally, as we, are add more new capabilities, are able to enhance the work process even more. So
Yeah.
I think helping them understand that learning curve, I think at first, glance, they don't see, right, the improvement. So I think that's the biggest challenge, is they're thinking perhaps it's not making improvement when it really is. So
That's interesting. Well, what do you think? Do you have a sense for what the consequences are to the frontline workers and to the organization when they're not given the time that they need? Like, what happens? What doesn't work, or what goes wrong when they're not given that time?
the thing that we see on the business readiness team is that we get more questions, a lot of questions, and more, service, support tickets and those types of things. So our objective is to try to provide as much learning as we can up front, so that, we reduce the frustration, on the back end, looking for support or asking questions. Sometimes I find myself developing large, frequently asked question documents that basically repeat the learning,
Yep.
right? And that's on the back end. So what we want to do is move that time to the front end, right? So they have to spend less time asking for help, when they're trying to implement.
Yeah. I've heard from a few companies, some of it's on the podcast, some of it's just a result of, our normal business, that sometimes the challenges that come up, with either poor adoption of the technology, or people are using it, but they may not be using it correctly, or, essentially as it was intended. The effects of that are not necessarily felt by the men and women on the front lines themselves. The effects are felt by people downstream, people in the back office that have to correct invoices or correct orders or correct,
Hmm.
other
Hmm.
things that are a result of those missteps. Do you see that at all when you're trying to get adoption across the board with those folks on the front lines?
I've seen it improve, vastly over time. Again, I was in customer service. I saw the constant, fixing afterwards of the invoices.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that I think it's a lot different. We've come a long way, and so I see us in a much better place. I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head,
Yeah.
where we've spent a lot of time, you know, helping even in-person training or virtual training, explaining things, so that and we can't capture everything in our training content,
Of
right?
course.
Our frontline workers know more than we do about their day-to-day activities, and so getting that feedback and incorporating it into learning best practices, success stories. I see us much further down the road. I don't think we're fixing as much as we were in the past.
Yeah. It, I would say more in the last probably 3 months, I've
Mm-hmm.
heard from learning and development leadership and change
Mm-hmm.
leadership teams, this idea of bringing agile into training and communications.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting, from a software development standpoint, that's been an
Mm-hmm.
approach that's been used. We're not trying to boil the ocean all at one
Mm-hmm.
time. We're trying to make incremental changes and be
Mm-hmm.
responsive and nimble and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it absolutely makes perfect sense to approach learning and communication in the same way. And I think one of the things that is really important in that is having a feedback loop, having mechanisms to understand, what's working, what's not, and how we can continue to improve that. Have you uncovered any interesting ways to gather that feedback? Like, what's driving you when you think about that agile approach? What's driving you to make those changes? Where do you get that information from?
Yeah, we're increasing our communications around this area. So we are making our release notes more available, as well as we leverage a feedback forum that's linked directly into our tools, and we're taking those feedback from the forums and bringing them into our agile development processes. And we're actually listening to our end users, and
Now,
not
wait a
just
second. Did you just say you're actually listening to the feedback? Is that what you just said?
we are. We're putting it into our roadmaps and our backlogs, and we're really excited to see that grow and develop. I mean, we just started, but we've seen it done successfully, and want to do more of it. We're starting to roll out new tools to larger and larger audiences, and we need to be able to have a place to collect all that and really apply that to what we're developing. So we're more focused on what's in our release and what do our users saying.
Yeah. Have there been any surprises that have, at least surprises to you, maybe not to others, but surprises to you when you've gotten some of that feedback where you've said, oh man, we would never have imagined that this would have been something that they've wanted, or that we misunderstood this process? Anything that really kind of caught you off guard in that way?
I don't know if it's anything that caught us off guard, but I think it gives us insight into how the tool's being used. As, for instance, where we were asked to develop a standard template of a particular output document for our customers, and build it in a way that they can just go copy and paste a particular type of template versus them having to build it from scratch every time. So as they're using it, they're seeing some efficiencies, and they're providing that feedback to us. And then we are developing like standard templates and things that they can copy into their tools, whether it's a setup they did or something that they've done at one customer that could apply to another, right? Able to copy those type of templates and reuse them. So I think that's the biggest feedback and biggest thing we've been able to give back to them.
So you have been able to take that feedback and turn it into something as part of a new release.
One other piece of feedback now that comes to mind is that we had built some mobile phone applications for the reps to use out in the field, but when we went to the pandemic, we got a lot of feedback from the field that our customers wanted to use those, but they didn't have the mobile phones. They weren't issued mobile phones. And so we quickly turned that application into a desktop application, just so that our customers can use it. So another piece of feedback that we're getting from the field, about how things are going at the customer site, how they're applying it, and letting us know. So
this, the name of the show is Frontline Innovators. And this part of the awesome aspect of this is that the men and women on the front lines, if we really set this up right, they could be the eyes and ears for the organization, right? So they're not just the executors, but they are part of the feedback mechanism. And so that example that you just shared is awesome, that they're listening to their customers. They have insights that are feeding back into the organization at headquarters that may not have their finger on the pulse, just because in the same way that the men and women who are out there with customers day in and day out every day, and they're hearing that feedback and those anecdotes, it's a fantastic example. I love to hear that. What do you think is when you're thinking about how to deploy change for the men and women in the field? You've talked a lot about training and communication, and I'm wondering if you have tools that you use in your organization specifically to communication. Obviously, I'm in the business. I have a technology platform for training, so that's of interest to me. I'm just curious to hear what other tools you're using around that front, but also on the communication front. You've talked a lot about communication today as an integral part of change with training as well. And I'm just curious to understand, are you using tools from Microsoft? Are there other platforms that you're using today? How are you executing on that?
Yeah, our virtual training, we use Microsoft Teams. We have, communication tools. We have, I'm trying to think of the Salesforce.com communication tool, which is
like Chatter. Is it Chatter?
The marketing email tool.
Yeah. Okay.
I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head.
Okay.
We use that. We are working more. We have podcasts, so we created our own podcast.
Oh, really?
A couple of years ago, which we need to kind of use some more and get more people using. But trying to get the voice of the field, the voice of our business out to the end users. So we're doing that as well. One of the things that I wish we had, is the way for training, we incorporate business scenarios into our e-learning. We incorporate benefits, application type of scenarios into our training, as well as, what button to click and what button not to click and those types of things. I would love some kind of journey type of training because our frontline workers are not only using the tools, but they're in front of the customer and they have different applications. And I would love to be able to capture that in some type of, virtual training or in a way that shows the whole picture. I've used some journey mapping, and that's nice to do the build, but to get that perspective, back in our training would be wonderful.
Yeah, that makes sense. What do you think is when you talk about those the scenarios and the journey? Are there disconnects between the learning and the actual scenarios? Like I feel like what you're saying there is that there are some gaps between kind of the real world versus the content that you're creating. Can we explore that a little bit further?
The gaps are getting the training into their hands at the right time and the right topic, in smaller chunks. So we found ways to integrate training content into their existing tools, as far as linking them to training learning management systems, as an example. And we really like that, but it almost seems like it's an extra step. And the more we can integrate the training, but not just the tool maintenance, but where do you use this? What kind of conversations do you have when you see this information? how do you address this situation? Those are the kind of gaps that I'd love to fill when it comes to training.
Yeah, that makes sense. Have you tried anything thus far?
Not yet. We've been busy kind of getting the training into the platform, as well as integrating our feedback forum. So it was a magic wand dream that I have, that I was like, okay, what's next? I know we use some virtual reality type things for our services. I'd love to kind of integrate, that into the training somehow. So.
Yeah, no, that's great. I actually just talked to another, he will be a future podcast. We just had our prep call this afternoon, but he was telling me about using some virtual reality tools in order to help their field service technicians in the field. And I think that's such a great example of some of the possibilities. I mean, this is an app that you can basically download off the App Store. There's obviously an enterprise solution around that. But I mean, these tools are here and available today to really help facilitate. In that case, it's really more of a remote support solution, so that when somebody in the field doesn't know how to do something, they have the ability to access remote support. Yeah. But it's all of these incredible tools that 5 or 10 years ago just would have been impossible, or only in our mind, that are really here and available today. And so there's really no excuse for not exploring them and seeing how they can improve the business. That kind of brings me to the next thing that I wanted to explore with you, just is about what do you see in, like, we talk a lot about the future of work, and I think the future has been brought a lot closer in the last 2 years because there's been so much acceleration. The pace of this change is just really accelerated. And I think the pandemic has forced us to be more open-minded to change, all the things that we've been talking about up until this point. When you think out a few years ahead, what do you think the future of work for the frontline workforce really looks like, and how's it different than today?
I just, I envision, the future being that, we're rolling out new features that are very easy for them to pick up and move and do things with. It depends on the complexity of the business, and ours is complex. I'd love to see where things were so intuitive that they didn't need training, but there's a lot to learn in our business. And so how can we take that mindset and apply it? I really want to understand what the impacts are on that learner experience, and understand the journey and understand the personas, so that we don't have to worry about testing or training, that we can just try something quick. And we've done it in a couple of places, and it's rapid development and rapid release, and so love to kind of see how that goes.
Yeah, that's excellent. I listened to a podcast recently, somebody else's podcast. I'm actually trying to get one of these folks onto Frontline Innovators, because they had some really interesting perspectives. But they talked about this perception that we all have, that kind of consumer market, things are just so intuitive. We just pick them up and we can just start using them. And that's something that we want to try to model, inside enterprise applications. But he brought up a bit of a counterpoint to that, which is that some of the things that seem so incredibly intuitive are really accompanied by literally multi-billion-dollar marketing programs, which is essentially part of, I'll use Apple as an example, right? Long before the release, or before I got an iPhone 13 in my hands, I'd been inundated by advertising from Apple telling me that, if I had this new phone in my hand, I was going to become a cinematographer because of all the great capabilities of the camera. And they were showing me advertisements about the capabilities of the camera, right? And they were going in deep on all of these new capabilities. So lo and behold, when I get this thing in my hand, what's the first thing I do? I go start exploring the capabilities of the camera. And that wasn't an accident. That's exactly what Apple wanted me to do, right? They were helping, they were essentially enabling it. That's their change management strategy for me as a consumer, right? They had a very thorough communication plan where they spent probably tens or hundreds of millions of dollars communicating to the public as this new phone was coming out and becoming more widespread. And then once I actually got this thing in my hand, I'm like, oh, this thing's got a massive camera, and things feel very intuitive and easy. But that was accompanied by a pretty big messaging plan, And so I wonder, I think there are always ways that we can improve the intuitive nature of the applications, but I think we just can't lose sight of the fact that even in the consumer markets, we are being educated. We're just being educated in a different way. We're not being educated by an email from HR or an email from the project team, but we are being educated through advertising and some of those other, communication methods from those consumer companies. I don't know. Do you feel the same way about that, or do you see it differently?
I do feel the same way, and here's how I like to apply that to business to business and complex, not multi-million dollar campaigns.
Yep.
Is really capturing those best practices and those success stories that we are having, and communicating those effectively and throughout our work for frontline workers. Really sharing all these best practices and helping people see what can be done when you apply the technology and your skills and your creativity, right, to the tools that we're rolling out. So I really think that comes those testimonials from our customers, best practices, success stories. We have to speak them loud and wide. I think that's our marketing campaign, and it doesn't cost $1 million. It just causes cost us the sharing of our knowledge, right?
Yeah, and I'm glad you're separating. I maybe overemphasize the budget, that Apple and Samsung and the other guys are making.
Yeah.
That is actually not the point. You've actually made the better point, which is that they, with their expensive ad campaigns, are doing something very similar to what you just talked about. So to reuse my Apple 13 example, what did they do? They showed me a bunch of video clips that were made with an iPhone 13, and they showed that I can be like this person who made this amazing video, right? That was actually part of their ad campaign. And they're showing us all of the things that we can do, and they're showing us the best practices of how we can use the camera, right? And the amazing outcomes that we can have when we get that camera. That is exactly what you just said in terms of taking those stories, using them as best practices to help the next folks understand what's possible, right?
Yeah.
And so you're absolutely right. It's not important about the size of the budget. What's important is that we're taking those messages about how to do things and why to do things and what's possible with this new technology, and giving them those case studies so that they can see themselves in that future state. I think is what you're saying. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
that's
I think
that's exactly what I'm saying. And we have some great ones, and it's just a matter of letting everyone know and making sure it's in front of people. And if that means more champions, more subject matter experts, walking alongside those who are learning, and showing them the way, paving the path, that is what we hope to do.
Yeah, that's excellent. You think there's anything that's misunderstood about the men and women on the front lines? You sound like you have such a great connection with them and true relationships. And there have been a few people that I've had on the podcast that have spoken about it, not as just empathy with a desire to understand, but actually relationships. I think I've given her a shout out a couple of times, but Jennifer Pickert over at Southwest Airlines actually talked deeply about the relationships, and the importance of those relationships. And I hear that a lot in what you're talking about. And I wonder if that gives you any insight that maybe others don't know. What's something that maybe you've uncovered about the men and women, something that maybe the rest of us don't really understand about that kind of worker profile, these men and women that are hustling, that are out in front of your customers? Anything that you can teach us about them that you've learned?
Our business readiness team has customer success managers, and they used to be frontline workers, right? So that's very helpful in helping us, understand and be empathetic, as well as, going out and talking with them and helping see what their challenges are, And, we do that as much as we possibly can as far as being in front of them and listening and hearing their feedback and their questions, because their questions mean they don't understand, which means we
Right.
can build better training and we could, build better tools. So that helps us understand them. I don't know if they're misunderstood as much as we just need to go out and listen to them more and go out into the field. And it's been unfortunate, that we can't do it during the pandemic, but we've done that in the past, and it's always been, eye-opening to really get in and listen to our field force.
For the last 10 or 15 years of my career,
Mm-hmm.
with the exception of the last 2, I've probably been out in the field, in trucks, at airports, in warehouses, in manufacturing facilities. I'm having like withdrawal symptoms, because that is my favorite part of doing what we do, is getting out to actually see how the world works, see how the men and women are interacting with their environments. And of course, I've got a technology bent, so I'm always interested in seeing how the technology is fitting into their work. And I've just really, really missed that part. And so I'm so excited that things seem to be getting back into some state of normalcy. And I'll be very excited as we can continue to do some more of those field trips. I think it's awesome to hear you talk about the importance of getting out there and the lessons that can be learned from that.
Yeah, for sure.
What's the, we're already coming up close on the end of time here, but I want to make sure I hear this from you. And that is, what do you think is the impact or the contribution that you've made in your organization that you are most proud of throughout your career?
I'm most proud of the relationships that I've made out in the field that help build trust, to work with my frontline workers and build trust so that it does help adoption, whether it helps me build better training, or whether it helps them, try it, give it a try, think about changing, go through the change curve, go with me through this, we're going to go through this together. And so I'm just most proud of, the trust that I've built with them. As a large sales force, it's not just me. We've got a large team. But for me personally, that's what I'm most proud of.
That's excellent. It's and not surprising, just listening to you talk for the last little bit since we've started this conversation. It's not surprising that you would place such an emphasis on that. Is there any advice that you would give to the folks that are listening that may be dealing with frontline workers and mobile technology deployments and things like that for the first time? Any advice that you'd give to them from the things that you've learned over your time doing this?
Listen, of course, take feedback, and, take it seriously. Sometimes, we listen to feedback and you have to balance, right? Is that an individual's perspective versus group perspective? So listen, and then perhaps get other feedback from other users and see if it's consistent. Test it out. Send out a survey, or it just help to understand how consistent the feeling is. Don't jump, to a conclusion based on one piece of feedback. Gather this feedback from as many people as you can, and test out your hypotheses and apply them. So.
Yeah, I'm always intrigued with the idea of trying to figure out the right sample size for that feedback in organizations like yours that have hundreds or thousands, or in some organizations, tens of thousands of people. How do you know what the appropriate sample size is to make sure that we're collecting feedback and that we don't just have some outliers that end up, pulling us in one direction or another? Yeah. And I don't know, my conclusion, I think, from listening to a lot of folks like you, is that it's part science, part art in trying to figure that out. But also something else that you've talked about a lot today is not being so rigid in any one plan, but that as we continue to learn and as you continue to get feedback, that you can be more nimble with your plan over time.
Yeah, I mean, we've we've adopted a science. We have sales districts, we have global regions. So we make sure that we're looking at different cultures. We make sure that we're looking at different application business scenarios, right? So that we know that it isn't just good for one business, it's good for multiple businesses. We work with multiple business units all the time. So it is part science, and we also trust the people that are giving us feedback. We ask for honest feedback, and they do a good job. They do a good job at that.
You've definitely made the case to me, and I'm sure our listeners as well, of the importance of developing those relationships so that you can have a culture of trust. And then, I know it sounds so obvious, but actually listening to the feedback that you're getting from the field, incorporating that, using that as part of the communication plan, I think you've really laid out a lot of best practices that I know I'll be able to take into my day, and I hope some of our listeners will be able to do the same. So thank you for all your input today.
Well, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. And it's so great to meet you, Justin.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
You as well. I do have to wrap it up there.
Sure.
So to our audience, I hope you found this conversation as enjoyable as I have. I know we got a lot of great tidbits from Susan throughout the show. If you have enjoyed this as much as I have, please share and rate the podcast. 5-star ratings help ensure that it gets promoted to other professionals like you that are innovating on the front lines. Reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Skillful, the mobile digital adoption platform for deskless and frontline workers. Visit the website at skillful.com. It's SKYLLFUL.com. And we're always looking for new guests on the show. So if you or someone you know is out there innovating on the front lines, we'd love to hear about it. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn and make an introduction and share your story. And maybe we'll see them on the next episode. Susan, thanks again for your time today.
You're welcome.